Our next presenter, or our next presentation is Exploring Food, Mino Pimatisiwin, Good Life Through the Lens of Indigenous Agriculture and Law, respecting how Indigenous control of food production is building food sovereignty models across Turtle Island. Please join me in welcoming Stephen Penner.
Bajuna Dinaway Maginadog, Mang Indaznake, Mangan Makade Dodem, Wemshtushki Nidao. And first of all, I want to honor this place of the Madakwin Sioux Nation, honor Mother Earth, honor Minnesota Makoche, the land where the waters reflect the clouds, home of the Wapaki and Anishinaabe, and original home of the Oseti Sakowin. My talk covers colonial food systems from an empirical perspective, what I found in looking at Indigenous food sovereignty, looking at the evidence, and exploring community-based sovereignty in foods, which is my favorite part. The numbers today. Numbers do not lie. These numbers reflect the reality of non-Indigenous food systems that are controlled by corporations and outside governments, not the people they serve, not in the way that law and traditions would look at them. Indigenous agriculture requires an adoption of a multi-generational and sustainable lens. Indigenous laws and Indigenous agriculture have supported and sustained Indigenous people on Turtle Island since time immemorial. There is no other way. Experientially, one had to learn from the land, the creator, Nanabuju, Mother Earth, Sedna, or the white buffalo woman, what needed to be eaten, what could not be eaten, when to plant, when to harvest, and how and where to gather medicines. The quote in front of you is expressed by White, who does a lot of work on Indigenous food sovereignty. But my friend Andy would say, when we hunted moose or goose, we were required to share, as we recognized that when our neighbors hunted, we might need to share in the kill. A consensus framework or a law was formed. Some very data-based facts, 15,000-foot facts in regard to the systematic and policy-based way Eurocentric governments tried to erase Indigenous pathways and laws and laid waste to Indigenous agriculture through policies and treaties, a form of democide or cultural genocide. One of the many experiences of multi-generational food trauma is that children experience in residential school. And the last residential school closed in Canada in 1996. George Manuel, the founder of the National Indian Brotherhood, stated, "Hunger is both the first and the last thing I can remember about school." And he was in Kamloops School. Every Indian student smelled of hunger. And Phil Fontaine cites Article 2 of the United Nations Convention on Genocide. A partial picture emerges regarding the status of food systems in Indigenous communities today. We have food prisons in some settings where certain nations are not free to trap by colonial systems. We have some communities like Garden Hill, which recognize a problem, and we have the picture in the middle which says, we don't need anybody. Some examples of current realities and challenges that many communities have taken up in order to correct, as Indigenous legal scholars Alfred and Corntassel state, the need to decolonize the diets. And as my good friend Charlotte Cote says, the Nucha Nuta need to assert sovereignty in their own nation. I spent the last 5 years reviewing and understanding the literature around Indigenous food systems, food sovereignty, and Indigenous food sovereignty, looking both the academic and community-based literature from across Turtle Island. Scholars like Hoover, White, Morrison, Delormier, Kunleen, Cote, along with many, many trips to communities around on Turtle Island. What did I discover? While exploring the question around the differences between Indigenous food sovereignty and food sovereignty, I discovered marked differences that are listed. Indigenous food sovereignty seeks to address the intergenerational food trauma, considers land management in a decolonized fashion, asserts land-based rights, preservation of Indigenous knowledge systems, and asserts legal basis of freedom and protection of resources. The thoughts, Indigenous law is relevant and important within an Indigenous ontological framework. Defining it from Western lens as order, customary law, and natural law, or to use any other qualifier devalues its legitimacy. Recognition of Indigenous law as law and not as lesser form of legal principle allows Indigenous nations to self-affirm. Exploring how Indigenous law supports Indigenous food sovereignty in communities, I settled on the Anishinaabe view of what legal support looks like, using the terms now I can't pronounce it, Pimatisiwin, respecting freedom, respecting treaties, autonomy, and self-determination. Ted Moses was one of the signatories to the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement, and he saw the disruption in his territory that was about to happen. he decided on trying to come to a consensus basis and come to some way of protecting his culture, his people, when things were going to be destroyed in his community. This was a binary choice that no community should ever have to face. So looking at what is good in communities and what comes from communities, what always has existed, we have the example of the Creator's Garden, Mijemden, which is set up in southwestern Ontario by Dr. Andrew Judge. The garden provides places for communities to come and eat and be with their culture and community. If we look, agriculture supports and sustains communities in ways Eurocentric views can only aspire to do. We look at these two slides and we see that Mino is a teacher, is enforcing democracy, is enforcing principles and enforcing the ways of Anishinaabe people view through the world. It can be large and vertically integrated, like cattle operations of the Quapaw tribe in Oklahoma that raises and processes beef and bison, heirloom tomatoes and honey. It can be local and based in tradition, like on the Back on the Land programs that operate in Pimatisiwin, which is a community in northern Manitoba. Indigenous agriculture can operate in remote locations such as Yupik-owned and operated quick-pack salmon sustainable fishery in Ammonik, Alaska. It can be small and scalable like the Arrowland Youth Blueberry Initiative, or it can be large like the Osoyoos Winery in BC. Indigenous agriculture can feed communities or create export opportunities, assist in the cultural restoration, generate income tax as own source revenue. It can emerge from entrepreneurial legacy that has carried Indigenous people into the 21st century. Indigenous agriculture is both correlated and causes Indigenous food sovereignty. Connected directly to Indigenous health determinants and practice in Indigenous ways relies upon the teachings of Indigenous law and has, and as I have said, existed from the beginning of time. Miigwech.